All right. Hello, folks. Happy Friday. We're going to start in just a moment. As I say just about every week at exactly this time, the virtual door into the webinar is apparently a single file door. And so we're going to let people kind of populate in, and we'll get started in just a minute. I'm going to give people one more moment. We're going to start at 3:33.
My guess is attendance is affected by Juneteenth.
That seems certainly possible. There are a lot of different events today and a lot of different observances. But with that in mind, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Smart, Equitable Commonwealth, co-creating the society we want. My name is Dan O'Brien. I'm the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. This is the 9th week of the conference, and we have an exciting discussion today about leveraging the 2020 census equitably. Just as a reminder, the podcasts for the first 8 panels are now available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. This is also where you will find all future podcasts released each Friday morning, so be sure to subscribe. And we will be announcing Slate 4 first thing Monday morning. We have a nice wrap up to the conference that will end by July 31st with a final keynote that we're really excited about, with a series of mayors and town managers talking about what cities and towns need now, and really bringing everything full circle for this conversation we've been having over the last few months. With that said, I want to turn to today's panel and specifically to introduce today's moderator, Beth Huang. She is the director of the Massachusetts Voter Table, working with over 25 community organizations to increase voter turnout and civic leadership in communities of color and working class people in Massachusetts. In this role, and very pertinent to today's panel, she also convenes Mass Counts, a coalition working with nonprofits with the goal of a complete count for the 2020 census. And so, as probably anyone here knows, this is really important, right? When it comes to data-informed policy, no data set is more influential than the census. I think sometimes we data wonks forget that because we're so excited about all the new and exciting novel data sets. But the census is still the basis of tons of decisions that we make as a society. It tells us where people live. It tells us racial composition. It tells us income. It tells us who needs support, who's vulnerable. It tells us all of those things, and so many decisions are made based on it. So having a complete count is absolutely critical. But also, as we're going to dive into today, all the other policies around it and decisions about how we use it, like differential privacy, which we'll talk a bit about today, also will have downstream impacts on how these data are used and therefore on the communities that are being counted. And that's what today's conversation is all about. So I'm going to turn it over to Beth in just a moment. Just as a weekly reminder, the Q&A is open. Please feel free to use it. And questions will be transmitted over to Beth as she leads the conversation forward. Also, we are monitoring Twitter. If you'd like to join us there and ask questions there, at BARI Boston and hashtag BARI 2020. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Okay, thanks so much, Dan. We really have an exciting conversation among researchers and experts. My name is Beth, and I'm the director of the Massachusetts Voter Table. In addition to convening mass counts, I also am on the working group for the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, which has raised over $1.4 million for nonprofits and civil society organizations to participate in the 2020 census. I really can't overstate how important the 2020 census is for the equitable redistribution of public resources for our communities and for political representation. Our participation in the census provides a complete picture of who lives in our neighborhoods. It provides the picture of how many ambulances are going to be deployed from different dispatch stations. It shows how many kindergarten classrooms we need. And so a complete count in the 2020 census provides the baseline for equity for the next decade. The census data validates why providing services in different languages is so important, and it really affirms why communities need more resources. Right now, in Massachusetts, 63.5% of households have responded to the 2020 census. 10 years ago, we had a self-response rate of 68.8% across the country. 61.5% of households have responded. Importantly, the census doesn't count every community equally well. Response rates still lag in many immigrant communities. There have been a number of media pieces this week about the slow response rates in Latinx communities. It's really difficult to overcome this political climate of fear and distrust in the federal government. And that's why organizations as part of mass counts have been preparing nonprofit organizations for almost 2 years now, and why we've made over 120,000 phone calls to residents of low response census tracts. And I know that Nancy is one of those callers. And we really are looking to explore in today's talk the trade-offs between privacy, accuracy, equity, and more, and all of the implications. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first panelist, Clemens Nolka, who is the research director of the Institute for Child, Youth, and Family Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. You might be on mute right now. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Beth. Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for joining. Our team has worked on the Child Opportunity Index for 10 years now. We released COI 1.0 in 2014 and 2.0 just in January of this year. So based at Brandeis University, the project is led by Professor Dolores Acevedo Garcia. It's based on a long-term collaboration with researchers at Ohio State University, and we're currently receiving funding from the Robert Wood Johnson and W.K. Kellogg Foundations. Neighborhoods differ on many features that are relevant for children's physical, emotional, social, and cognitive development. Think of the neighborhoods children in the Boston metro area are growing up in today. Do these neighborhoods provide access to green space and playgrounds? Do they have access to early childhood education? Do they have good schools? Do they have clean air, access to healthy food? Are they walkable and encourage physical activity? Do their schools have enough resources? Do they provide quality instruction? Neighborhoods also influence children's norms and expectations for the future, whether or not they expect to graduate from high school or go to college or find a good job. We want good neighborhood environments for children because good neighborhoods not only improve their everyday lives, but also their health and education in the short and in the long term. And the Child Opportunity Index is a metric that captures the wide range of neighborhood factors that matter for children today. It's based on 29 indicators spanning 3 domains. Included are many social determinants of health. It's granular neighborhood-level data for nearly all US neighborhoods that is comparable across neighborhoods and over time. It has good predictive validity compared to similar metrics, and it has users from many sectors in Boston and across the US. What is included and how did we build it? The 29 indicators are grouped into 3 domains. The education domain includes 11 indicators, 3 capturing access to and quality of early childhood education, 2 indicators of academic proficiency in 3rd grade, 3 capturing the quality of high schools and access to post-secondary education, and 3 indicators capturing resources important for educational achievement. In the health and environment domain, we have indicators for access to healthy environments such as green space or walkable neighborhoods, exposure to environmental toxins like microparticles and industrial pollutants, and access to healthcare. The social and economic domain includes an index of neighborhood economic resources and indicators of economic opportunity and family structure. To combine these indicators, we first standardized them and then took weighted averages of the indicator z-scores in each domain to obtain domain average z-scores. The indicator weights capture how strongly each indicator predicts 4 different health and socioeconomic outcomes. To obtain a single overall score, we then took a weighted average of the 3 domain scores. And lastly, we converted the scores into 2 easy-to-use metrics, child opportunity scores and child opportunity levels. Child opportunity scores vary from 1 to 100. To construct them, we ranked all neighborhoods on domain and overall scores and grouped them into 100 groups containing 1% of the population each, and then gave each group a score from 1, the lowest, to 100, the highest. Child opportunity levels are constructed in much the same way, the difference being that after ranking, we group neighborhoods into 5 groups labeled from very low to very high opportunity, each containing 20% of the child population. We've released different versions of these metrics for different use cases. If you want to compare neighborhoods in one metro area, use the metro norm metrics. For cross-metro within-state comparison, use the state norm metrics. And for all other cases, use the nationally normed metrics. What kind of stories about inequity can you tell with a COI? Now, this is a neighborhood map of the Boston metro area, focusing in particular on the city of Boston and its surrounding suburbs. You're seeing metro-normed opportunity levels with very low colored in the lightest and very high opportunity colored in the darkest blue. The COI clearly captures an urban-suburban opportunity gap with many low and very low opportunity neighborhoods within the city and some communities on the North Shore, and many high opportunity neighborhoods in the surrounding suburbs. This map shows where Black children live in relation to opportunity, primarily in very low opportunity neighborhoods inside the city. And here's where white children live, primarily in high or very high opportunity neighborhoods in the suburbs. More concretely, in the Boston metro area, 58% of Black children, but only 6% of white children live in very low opportunity neighborhoods. This pattern is reversed for very high opportunity neighborhoods. Hispanic children's access to opportunity is very similar to Black children's and very, very different from white children's. Asian children are much more likely to grow up in high or very high opportunity neighborhoods. Now, these differences in access to opportunity matter. Here is life expectancy at birth, averaged across all neighborhoods with the same level of opportunity in the Boston metro area. You can see a very clear gradient where more neighborhood opportunity is strongly associated with living longer lives. The gap between very high and very low opportunity neighborhoods is around 5 years. Here is again life expectancy, this time averaged across neighborhoods with the same child opportunity score. You see the same gradient, but what is now more apparent is how far apart neighborhoods in the tails of the opportunity distribution are. The gap in life expectancy for children born in the neighborhoods with the highest versus lowest score is nearly 9 years. Children born in the lowest opportunity Metro Boston neighborhoods can expect to live as long as children born in, for example, Colombia, Iran, or China. On the other end of the distribution, there's about 10% of children born in neighborhoods with life expectancies as high or higher than Japan or Switzerland, which are countries with the highest life expectancies on the planet. Now, These countries are thousands of miles apart. They have widely different economies, polities, and levels of development that explain the gaps in life expectancy. But in Metro Boston, these neighborhoods are just a few miles apart. They potentially have access to the very same resources, and yet they are worlds apart in terms of the opportunities they provide for children. How well does the COI predict other outcomes? We looked at 14 different health and socioeconomic outcomes measured for adults. These are R-squared statistics from bivariate regressions of these outcomes on the COI overall score. For Metro Boston, COI 2.0 explains, on average, 57% of the cross-neighborhood variation in these outcomes, which is good for a single metric. For all US neighborhoods, COI 2.0 explains on average around 50% of variation in these outcomes. That's a bit lower, but still very good for any single metric, and at least as good or even better than similar metrics of neighborhood opportunity. Let me quickly sum up. The COI 2.0 is a multi-sectoral metric of child opportunity capturing 29 neighborhood features that matter for children today. It's strongly predictive of adult health and socioeconomic outcomes, and it lets you tell compelling stories of spatial and racial ethnic inequities and access to opportunity in the Boston metro area and beyond. Thank you. We posted the slides for this talk on our webpage, diversitydatakits.org, in the news section if you're interested. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Clemens. It really shows why it's so important to have a complete count of kids in the 2020 census. The 2010 census missed 20,000 kids across Massachusetts, and we know that that compounds inequities. So thank you so much for sharing. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Cliff Cook, who is the Senior Planning Information Manager for the City of Cambridge in the Community Development Department. Cliff?
Oh, let me just get my slides ready here. So we should be able to start sharing the screen in a moment. Here. Sorry, having a little bit of trouble navigating suddenly. Let's see. Let's try this again. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. So before I begin, I'd like to thank my co-author, Bailey Werner, who prepared much of the analysis and mapping of this presentation. Now, the accuracy and completeness of the 2020 census has been a source of concern for some time. The citizenship question controversy and the pandemic have both gotten a lot of press. My focus today is on a third issue, the plan to apply differential privacy techniques to the results of the census. If not applied thoughtfully and carefully, differential privacy could affect the accuracy and usability of the data, exacerbating existing inequities affecting minorities and groups at risk. Today, I'll be talking from the perspective of an urban planner, not a mathematician or a statistician, but as a user of the data. So what is differential privacy? It's not an algorithm, but a group of mathematical techniques that can be applied to an algorithm. The concept is generally credited to a paper published in 2006. Whose lead author is Cynthia Dwork, a computer science professor at Harvard. Like other privacy methods, differential privacy balances the amount of information users can extract from a data set with the privacy of those who contribute the data. What's different about differential privacy, and this is the essence of the idea, is that the amount of privacy can be measured, rationed, and adjusted. The goal is to give each individual roughly the same privacy that will result from having their data moved from the data set altogether. In effect, it disguises each individual's contribution of data while providing a measurable trade-off between accuracy and privacy. And that's as much as I'm going to say about the math. Let's look at a non-mathematical example. Are you guys seeing the slides, by the way? Are they changing? No, okay, give me a moment. I'm not sure what is going on here. I'm sorry, just give me a moment to try to do this again. Oh dear. Are the slides changing now? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Just give me a second so I can get back to my notes. I'm sorry. So let's look at a non-mathematical example. On the On the left here, you see a impressionist, on the right, you see an impressionist painting by Monet, and on the left, a photo of the same scene taken about 100 years later. So what does this all have to do with Monet? The impressionist painting doesn't reproduce every scene of every detail of the original scene, but there's enough information there to understand where the actual location is. And so I'm having a little bit of difficulty here. I'm sorry again. Okay. Yeah, there's enough information there for the viewer to match the painting to the actual location. But if we were to compare a small segment of the painting to the corresponding part of the photo, we might find the noise overwhelms the data. The scene would be unrecognizable. We have a good idea what the image is like from a distance, but if we zoom in too closely, we can't make out the details. Similarly, with differential privacy, specific data points are perturbed, but if you know the process through which noise is added, you can take a step back, subtract the noise, and learn the average. Having trouble again getting this thing to advance. I am sorry. I'm not sure why I'm having difficulty here. It was working, then it stopped working. I may have to proceed without this. Give me one more moment, and I'll try one. I do not know why I'm having so much trouble. Now I lost my notes. I'm not having good luck here. Okay, so that works. All right. So in some respects, the Bureau's plan to apply differential privacy isn't a big change. The Census Bureau has used other privacy methods of prior censuses, such as data swapping and table suppression. In 2019, the Bureau issued a set of demonstration data to show what the application of differential privacy could look like. Analysis of the data was shared and discussed at a workshop in DC last December, and I think it's fair to say reports there raised a lot of flags. At higher levels of geography, the results are generally acceptable, but as geographic units multiply and populations drop in size, concerning trends appear. While the Bureau has been making changes to its plans, it's constructed to consider a couple examples from the demonstration data, since these illustrate issues that aren't so easily resolved. These examples will compare actual 2010 census results to the demonstration data, which took reported 2010 data, applied the differential privacy techniques, recompiled the results into tables, and we compare those tables to the original 2010 data. So let's see. Now I'm back having trouble again. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. There. Here we're looking at this blocks that reported no vacant units in 2010 in the demonstration data. And as you can see, the proportion of blocks and no vacancies quadruples in the demonstration data. Here's the vacancy rate. This is what it looks like when it's mapped. We're looking at block groups here for simplicity. And as you can see, there are just enormous swings in the vacancy rate all over the city. Here, back to it seems like my, this is better. Okay, here we have the numerical change in vacancy to the map. A handful of blocks. This happened again, sorry. And a handful of blocks are with decreases are concentrated in the central and eastern part of the Cambridge. The few large increases occur in block groups along the city's boundary. These shifts don't appear to obviously correlate with other features. Now we add large affordable housing complexes and a pattern begins to emerge. 3 of the 4 block groups, the largest increase in vacancy, correlate with affordable housing locations. And in the 4th case, a large graduate student housing complex whose population has similar characteristics. Vacancy is more highly concentrated than before. The new pattern could feed into a narrative about the quote unquote failure of affordable housing. Note these are also block groups of high proportions of racial and ethnic minorities, as is often true of affordable housing in this part of the country. And here's a second example of relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is where elders living alone reside. As we all know, it's a population that can have substantial housing, health, and human service needs. These problems tend to be addressed in fairly site-specific manners, so knowing where the households are concentrated is important. Here's a map showing the reported 2010 census data. And here's a map showing where the demonstration data places the same kind of households. The original data is certainly perturbed, but it's hard to see a pattern emerging. Now we switch to looking at the proportion of change and still no obvious pattern. But when you add both the numerical change in elders living alone and the locations of elderly housing, a pattern change appears. You find among a limited number of block groups with elderly housing developments, 10 lose households of this type and only 1 gains. While the number of elders living alone is relatively stable between the 2 data sets, block groups of elderly housing developments lose half their elders living alone, or about 600 out of 1,200 households. So what do we see here and why should we be concerned? First is what I call the no negative value effect. The census can't report negative counts of people, households, or housing units, but the application of differential privacy can push those values below 0. Fixing this problem reallocates negative shifts in value to geographies and larger cohorts for a given characteristic and creates an overall smoothing effect, such as we saw when we redistributed elders living alone from locations of large elderly housing developments. The small population effect refers to the disproportionately large effect in geographies with a relatively small number of cases for a given change in size, such as the small number of vacant units seen in most Cambridge block groups. Arguably, this is not a bug, but actually a feature of differential privacy if you were to look at the math. As most anyone working at the local level understands, location matters. Not employing a local geographic boundary to redistribute cases in reasonably close proximity undermines the accuracy and utility of the data. And as the data is spread over more and smaller units of geography, the degree of mismatch increases. While I was later told the Census Bureau did use a geographic boundary to control changes in the demonstration data, this is not evident during our analysis. It is clear any such boundary needs to be reasonably constrained, and that a one-size-fits-all solution, such as using county boundaries, will not work everywhere, and so not in New England. Then there's the fourth problem, the local knowledge problem. People know what their communities look like. They see an obvious disconnect between the data and what they know to be facts on the ground. They may discount the value of the data set altogether, in my experience. Now let's take a step back from the trenches and look at the bigger picture. While the math of differential privacy is applied equally and randomly to each data point, the result is by no means equitable, which a minor adjustment to the size of one group can have major consequences when applied to another. Displacing lower income elderly households makes them harder to find and assist. Boosting vacancy rates at large affordable housing developments can change the narrative in unpredictable ways. As we well know, people and populations not all have equal access to resources and social processes. If the census misrepresents a group, there's a good chance they won't be treated equitably when it comes time to make policy, design programs, or distribute resources. People who are not counted or miscounted do not have power. They may literally and figuratively not count. Now, I'd like to give you one more example. It gets right to the heart. While the demonstration data did not significantly affect the size and distribution of Cambridge's minority population, that was not true in many places. In one way, which is very much matters in questions of voting right districting. In these cases, the application of differential privacy to census data has the potential to hurt minorities in 3 ways. By diluting the strength of minority voting blocks, by making members of a protected class appear to live in places where they do not, and by disguising racialized voting patterns, which is one of the rationales for enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. So what next? The Bureau has been somewhat responsive to issues raised by the user community, but concerns remain. They've developed and shared metrics for measuring the effect of ongoing to their model, and they've been cooperating with the technical working group that came out of last year's conference. However, a key request from the user community is for a second set of demonstration data that shows the results of the proposed final differential privacy methods. And so far, the census has been saying there's not enough time to do this, which is leaving a lot of people feeling very uneasy. So what can you do? You can read up and stuff. You can follow this issue in the census website. Google 2020 disclosure avoidance system updates. Again, 2020 disclosure avoidance system updates, or you can send comments to the census at 2000DAS@census.gov. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Cliff. Wow, there are some really serious equity implications for the differential privacy model. Thanks so much for sharing. And we will continue this conversation about differential privacy with Nancy Krieger's talk. She is a professor of social epidemiology and American Cancer Society clinical research professor in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Thanks for joining us, Nancy.
Thank you for having me. So you should see the slides. So good afternoon. I'm very happy to present on behalf of my co-authors and myself our methodological study on US Census tract sources and monitoring health inequities, a methodological comparison of 2010 decennial census with and without differential privacy and American Community Survey 2008-2012 data. We have no conflicts of interest to declare. Funding came from an NIH grant and also my American Cancer Society Clinical Research Professorship, and we have IRB approval for this study. Additionally, as I do now for all my presentations, I want to acknowledge that I am on Indigenous lands and to pay heed to Indigenous critical thinking. And also, I speak at a time of great anger, outrage, and grief, as well as social mobilization over police killings and structural racisms, also COVID-19, which together are profoundly intertwined with issues of census data for counting and accountability. And lastly, this is June 19th, which is a day for reflection as well as celebration in terms of American histories of enslavement and changing that. Accurate census data are vital for public health, for denominators, for characterizing areas, and for allocating political representation and resources. However, little is known about how census tract estimates of health rates and inequities will be affected by major new change that will be implemented with the 2020 decennial census, differential privacy in brief. Basically, this refers to procedure, as just explained, whereby statistical noise is injected into publicly released decennial census data to protect individual privacy. New research has raised concerns that the combination of differential privacy and post-processing of these data may lead to potentially harmful distortions in population counts at levels of geography below the US states. We accordingly sought to investigate how census tracts estimates of mortality rates and inequities are affected by first, differential privacy, whereby the public decennial census data are injected with that statistical noise. Second, uncertainty arising from the small numbers of different persons surveyed each year in a given census tract for the American Community Survey. In brief, we compared estimates of the 2008 to 2012 average annual premature mortality rate, defined as death before age 65, in Massachusetts using census tract data from the 2010 decennial census, the 2010 decennial census with differential privacy, using the file that the US Census Bureau released in November 2019, and then third, the 2008 to 2012 ACS 5-year estimate data. Our data and our analytic approaches were as follows. First, we obtained individual level mortality data for 2008 to 2012 for all deaths under age 65, which was about 56,000 deaths, from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and geocoded the residential address of death corresponding to the census tract. Only 0.4% of deaths could not be geocoded with this level of precision, leading an analytic data set with 55,560 deaths. We analyzed premature mortality, again, death before age 65, because this outcome is widely used population health indicator that manifests strong social gradients and is not affected by misclassification of cause of death. Second, for our primary social indicator, we use the index of concentration at the extremes, or ICE, for the racialized economic segregation. This measure captures the extent to which a population in a given area is concentrated at either extreme of a social metric and ranges from -1, everyone is in the worst category, to 1, everyone is in the best category. For our analyses, we set the extremes for this ICE measure as first, high-income white alone populations versus B, low-income Black alone populations, and the formula is shown on the slide. Missing data precluded computing the ICE for 19 of Massachusetts census tracts, or only 1.3%. Third, for the sensitivity analysis, we also use census tract data on percent of persons below poverty. So here are our results shown graphically. We have data on premature mortality rates per 100,000 that we computed with our 95% confidence intervals. And on the other side, we show the incidence rates for premature mortality, comparing each quintile for the ICE measure for racialized economic segregation to the best off quintile. Results using the 2010 decennial census denominator data are shown in light gray. Those using the American Community Survey data for 2010, our 5-year estimates are shown with a dotted gray line. And those using the 2010 decennial census data with differential privacy are shown with the solid black line. And as you can see, the results are effectively identical across the 3 different denominator sources. This pattern also held when we stratified by gender and also by race ethnicity, and it additionally held when we focused instead on the census tract percent of persons below poverty. I promise you we triple checked the data to make sure we were not making any errors given the close resemblance of the results across all 3 denominator sources. So to our knowledge, our study is the first to compare estimates of premature mortality rates and inequities using this outcome using census tract denominators obtained from these 3 sources, 2010 decennial census, 2010 decennial census with differential privacy, and the 2008 to 2012 5-year estimate ACS data. Our results provide novel evidence that these estimates, at least in the state of Massachusetts, are robust to the source of denominator data employed. These findings held when aggregating across the total population and also in analyses stratified by race, ethnicity, and by gender. One key limitation of our study, however, concerns generalizability. Of note, we have previously validating using Massachusetts health data for diverse health outcomes across the lifespan, the approach of using census tract area-based socioeconomic measures. And this work has been used to inform public health research and population health monitoring across the US. That said, to test the generalizability of our findings, additional research, which requires individual records geocoded with precision to the census tract and other relevant geographic units, should investigate whether similar results are obtained for other states, also using census tract data, other small geographic units, especially those not nested within counties, for example, American Indian areas, also different health outcomes, for example, morbidity or health practices or cause-specific mortality, and with these outcomes selected to range across the life course, for example, from infancy to among the elderly, and also other commonly used analytic approaches such as regression modeling. An additional limitation is that our study did not statistically account for spatial correlation among the census tracts or the available margins of error for the ACS estimates. This is a focus of our ongoing work. We further note that the US Census Bureau, informed by data user feedback, is actively working to address problems identified with the decennial census data released with differential privacy that was the November 2019 issue that we used. And that especially affected population counts adversely for small populations, especially American Indians and Alaska Natives, and for geographic areas that are not part of the main census geographic hierarchy, i.e. nation, state, county, census tract. New research that assesses the improved census data with differential privacy when publicly released will be urgently warranted. The larger public health implications of our study are twofold. First, our results provide initial evidence that monitoring of population health and health inequities using aggregated census tract population denominators may not be adversely affected by the impending shift to use of differentially private census data, starting with the 2020 decennial census. Second, our study provides a straightforward methodological template that other health researchers and public health agencies can use to evaluate the impact of decennial census when using census data to calculate population rates and monitor health inequities, including for new releases of US Census data with improved decennial differential privacy and post-processing protocols. Finally, at the end, may I note that may George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others rest in justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you for that important framing about this current movement moment when I think many people across this country and certainly in Greater Boston are going through a reckoning about what racial inequity and racial justice mean. And so I guess before, so please do feel free to ask questions in the question and answer box. I guess to get us started, I really am, have been very impressed with the work of some of the associations and mutual aid societies of some of the smallest ethnic groups in Greater Boston and in Massachusetts. One of the groups that has done so much to get out the count in the 2020 census is the Cape Verdean Association, because they truly want to know how many people of Cape Verdean heritage there are in Greater Boston. I imagine that the impact of differential privacy could be pretty immense on the smallest ethnic groups that have very intense needs around language access, health inequities, and more. Do any of you want to share more about what the implications of differential privacy might be on some of the smallest ethnic groups? And is there anything that advocates or organizers or leaders can do to really make the case about what they need in case the data is impacted by differential privacy, although it seems like it might not be so bad. How much should this be on our mind?
Yeah, I'm willing to jump in and say that getting good data on every group is critical, and the work that your organization is doing to try to get out the census count is essential. And I think that that's the starting point, because the differential privacy is applied to whatever data come in. And if data are not there, that is a problem. So I think that the first and foremost thing is always getting as much good data as possible, because other things are manipulation of those data. And that would be my biggest concern, frankly.
Yeah, I would I would second that. I think the key thing here is first making sure we have as complete a count as possible. But I think the differential privacy does throw a bit of a wild card in here in terms of how it's going to work out. The census clearly is making some progress, and they had an announcement this week that seemed to indicate they've been able to improve some of the results just looking at raw population counts at different levels of geography. But this is really a multi-layered problem, because first you've got the people that you're counting and you've got their characteristics. Then you have to join them into households. And each time you take another step, you're introducing more opportunities for more problems. And then going from there to the Cape Verdean population, for example, which is not explicitly counted by the census, since my understanding is they're not a Latino population, so they're not counted as Hispanics, where there's more detail. You're going to have to extrapolate whatever data is counted from there then to the American Community Survey. Key thing is, again, just getting everybody out there and getting them to respond. I think in terms of what this is going to mean for the differential privacy, I think that elected officials are going to have to take a very hard look at this data when it comes out. And I really think that they need to be thinking about taking appropriate action, maybe even legal action, if they do not like what they're seeing. Because there were concerns raised at that conference in December that I don't think have been addressed about how you go from counting people of a certain group to then perturbing that number and then using that number to generate data that's going to be used to enforce the Voting Rights Act and apportion representation appropriately. I don't think that really has been addressed, and I think the Census Bureau didn't really get the point. And I'm even sure some of the people there really welcomed hearing that perspective, as I recall from that particular session. And I think there's a lot of chapters that have to be written here.
Are there, I guess I'm really curious, what are some of the biggest implications of each other's research on what you think might be your work? How do you feel like your research relates to each other?
Well,
and are there any questions that folks have for each other?
Nancy, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, with seeing presentations like Cliff's, which is similar to what he showed at the December meeting, that really motivated what our project was. And we were surprised by our results. And we, again, don't know how generalizable or not they are from what we saw in Massachusetts. And where they speak directly to the work that Clemens Nolke is doing is that his indices rely on similar kinds of metrics that are constructed from census-based measures and are area-based census indicators. So there are clear connections, which is that if the indicators are not indicating what they ought to and are divorced from reality or skewing reality, then that is major problems with regard to both A, political representation, which is a key reason for the census, and B, what the funding resource allocations are that depend on population counts. So I think all of ours are very connected and are speaking to the why we value census data and need it to be accurate for the purposes intended.
Yeah. Speaking for myself, I find Nancy's results very interesting and actually somewhat reassuring, because it does seem to indicate that when you're taking a step back and looking at a whole, you're still going to get results that are usable. And we've worked with Clemens before and are very interested in his data set and have been looking for opportunities to employ his work and our work. But again, the census data underlies everything that we're doing at different levels here.
And I would emphasize a key thing is that the presentation that Cliff had was trying to look at estimates for particular areas down to the block group level. We were aggregating across census tracts to get a bigger picture of what the extent of the inequities are in mortality. We would be doing that whether there was differential privacy or not. Our question was how much it was affected by differential privacy.
Do any of you have other questions for each other?
I would have one for Nancy. This was really striking, and in a way, it's a bit of a relief that you don't see a strong effect of differential privacy on these estimated associations. I was just curious if you have an explanation. I mean, just naively, I would have expected that the estimation weakens a bit, and the sort of gradient you see is weaker once you add noise to the.
Yeah.
That's one question, and the second question was, how were your ICE measures correlated across the different sources? Because that sort of speaks to another issue, right? For the more descriptively minded analysis of the kind that Cliff was conducting, how much misclassification or misallocation or mismeasurement there might be?
So to answer your two questions, one, here again, remember, we have a very, very strong signal. There are really strong inequities in premature mortality. So we didn't see, so I think, you know, if maybe you were looking at something where you had much smaller risks, you might be a little bit more worried. But here we picked up that signal as strong, equally strong with all three denominators. Secondly, we looked at the correlations and we looked at the construction of the measures. One thing to say is that our particular ICE measure, we could only do those comparisons for the ICE that was just for race ethnicity, because the only way you get the ICE with race ethnicity plus income data is to use the actual ACS data, because the census data don't have the economic data, they have just the racial data. So we did look at the comparison of the ICE measures across just using the ICE for race ethnicity, for example, setting, for example, as one group, either Black population versus white population, non-Hispanic, or looking at people of color versus white non-Hispanic. And we found for the race one, we found very high correlations looking at just the 2010 census data with decennial census versus decennial census with differential privacy. But again, we couldn't make that comparison with the data for the one with racialized economic segregation, because that can only be obtained at this point from the ACS data with the income.
Mhm.
Thank you.
We did have a few
I want to make
questions.
clear, I don't know
go
that
ahead.
our results generalize across, you know, Massachusetts is a particular state. It's got census tract, you know, it's got its 3,500 whatever census tracts. It's got a different geographies than something like whether in Idaho or something like in Mississippi or something like, I mean, what I see our studies doing is an invitation for replication in different areas, but you have to have individually geocoded health records in order to do that.
I would just second what Nancy said. I think Massachusetts actually came out pretty well in some of the overall analyses of differential privacy that we saw at that conference. Nancy was there as well. In contrast, you had a state like Alaska, where they've got a lot of very small places that don't really correspond. They don't correspond to census tract boundaries or other boundaries, and they were having demonstrated horrendous problems, and to the point where the data was utterly unusable for them.
Right.
So it's hard to know how generalizable it is. And big point of contention is that the Census Bureau in the demonstration data did not include what's called places in their geographic spine. They went from counties to census tracts. In Massachusetts, we have places. We have our 351 cities and towns, which pretty well map with census tracts in our case, which is, I gather, not always true. So when we looked at MCD level data, minor civil division level data in Massachusetts, it was still pretty good. But in other parts of the country, it was a very different story. So it would be interesting to see how well this applies in other, particularly when you get outside of the Northeast and the Midwest, where the states are divided into towns or townships by and large. You go out, say, to California or Alaska, where you've got many small Native American settlements, you've got many small boundaries that tend to run higgledy-piggledy based on development patterns. Another thing I would note is that when we go to really a hyper-local look at the data like we do in Cambridge, that's where I think some of the issues really start to show up, and it becomes very hard for us to know what to believe at a certain point. If we see crazy vacancy rates in places where we know they don't exist, because of very detailed local knowledge of our city, it starts to raise up lots of other questions for us. Whereas you may be able to take that, and if you look across Middlesex County as a whole, maybe that a lot of these issues smooth out and things look pretty good. And in many parts of the country, looking at the county is perfectly fine, but it just doesn't work in Massachusetts or the rest of Southern New England.
That's super interesting. Very much related to the title of this week's panel, Leveraging the 2020 Census Equitably. How are data persuasive to policymakers? And if so, could you describe some effective communication practices for change?
I'm sorry that got cut off when you were speaking.
Sure. So all of you do research that is that fundamentally speaks to the need to use data to make the case for racial equity. How are data persuasive to policymakers? And if so, please describe some effective communication practices for change.
So I would like to jump in and say that policymakers are never the only audience. I think the past several weeks have shown there has been data for a very long time, and I've worked on it, many colleagues have, around racism being a public health crisis, and policymakers haven't listened. People out on the streets are making people listen and also bringing to the fore what the data are. So we're actively, in my team, we're very engaged in trying to get good work out there on what the COVID-19 inequities are, despite absolutely lousy data on race ethnicity. It's improving slowly, and a complete lack of inclusion of socioeconomic data with those. Getting that data out to people that are most effective, they're the ones that actually communicate in lots of different ways to the policymakers, not just by the presentation of the data themselves, but also about whether they're gonna let people stay elected or not. So I think that it's really important never to think the data ever A, speak by themselves, B, never to have only the policymakers as an audience. But at the same time, you wanna have rigorous, solid data. It's not good for people, and particularly trying to address health inequities, to have data that are not credible. So I'm still, I guess one might say slightly old-fashioned and think reality exists and that we have to try to understand it in many different ways from many different vantages. But that's really critical. So yes, you can show maps, but maps, there's a very famous book about, how to lie with maps, just like by Momonier, just like you can look at how to lie with statistics. Maps can be easily distorted, but maps can also effectively tell stories. But I think the key thing is that the researcher should always have a sense of the dual audience, of the people who will be most energized and able to work with the data to bring their case to policymakers, as well as talk to policymakers. And it's not either or, it's a both and approach.
Absolutely. I know that community leaders who we work with at the Massachusetts Voter Table use data to validate what they see in their communities every single day to policymakers, to funders, to their own members and more. Clemens or Cliff, do you want to share how you've been able to communicate data persuasively to make social change, or to make the case for social change?
Clemens?
Cliff, do you want to go first or should I?
Why don't you go first?
Okay. I mean, this is a very, but I can just say from our own experience, I mean, of course, it depends. We don't have data on a representative cross-section of policymakers and how amenable they are to data on average. For us, I think one important, you have to sort of tell stories visually with compelling sort of representations of the data that are easy to grasp. Maps are one tool that I think many people can relate to because they don't, they are somehow, they tend to be more relatable. I think it's important that what you're showing resonates also with what people know. The data have to be credible. Those are both points that Nancy and Cliff have already made. So they have to reflect what people know also is true about the neighborhoods they live in or the communities they serve. Framing, I guess, is another issue. We deliberately, we have spent some time thinking about the Child Opportunity Index, and we deliberately call it an opportunity index and not an index of deficiency or disadvantage, or to focus on something positive. of course, are very correlated with measures of disadvantage or similar to those, but I think that the framing here matters, so that not to highlight communities for something negative, but emphasize opportunity and so catching up to higher opportunity communities.
And I would add here, I mean, we chose our measure of the index of concentration at the extremes specifically because it offers a way of getting at social spatial polarization, and it shows both of the groups affected at the key extremes. So for example, many of the measures that are only in a sense bring in one of the social groups at issue, typically, as Clemens was just saying, often the groups that are most harmed by structural racism and related kinds of economic deprivation and class injustice, if you leave out the people that are benefiting on the other side. So the point of our measure, by bringing in the spatial social polarization, which is getting worse, is to bring in both groups so that you're always being able to see where is there the concentration that's happening of people who are high income, white, non-Hispanic, and they're always part of the picture. That's part of the nature of a segregation scale of some sort or polarization scale has the groups that are in social relation both there, not just one or the other. And so I think that the choice of metric and how it's interpreted is also really, really important. And does it show the metric itself what relationships are of inequity?
Mm-hmm. Cliff, do you have anything that you want to add? Is there anyone who wants the last word on this?
Okay. Unfortunately, I lost a lot of the audio there, but I understand your question to be how have we been able to use data to affect change. I guess one example I would point to was taking a very deep dive into people in poverty in Cambridge. And in our case, Cambridge is a very heterogeneous place. Your neighbors 3 blocks away could be living in a very different circumstance than you are. And I think people have kind of gotten away from that at one point. And a few years back, we took a very close look at this. And I think that really moved the needle and got people talking about, Cambridge is, of all places, has got the resources. We could do better, and we really needed to try to do better. That would be one example. Another is on an ongoing basis, we provide a lot of information about our neighborhoods, which people seem to have an endless fascination for. And I think people always find something surprising when they look in there and they start examining it more closely.
Absolutely. Well, really, I want to thank you all so much, Nancy, Cliff, and Clemens, for sharing your really insightful research. And I really couldn't agree more that the basis of good data for the next 10 years is the 2020 census. We are continuing to make calls to get out the count, and so this is a core way to advance racial equity. So if you feel so inclined to ensure that all households across Massachusetts are participating in the 2020 census and we get the accurate and complete data, I highly encourage you to join one of our regular Mass Counts phone banks. With that, so really thanks so much for joining us today. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Dan, who I think is going to take us into happy hour.
Oh, well, thank you, Beth. And thank you to all the panelists. This is a wonderful conversation. So thank you, Clemens, Cliff, Nancy, for sharing your great work with us. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure all the attendees did as well. And it's just so great to have a panel that sort of hits on all angles, right? We saw how census data can be directly valuable. We saw direct concerns and also validation or evaluation of a policy being taken around the census with differential privacy. And Beth, as you kind of led us through the wilds here, you also shared with us direct activism in terms of how we can make the census and its impact more equitable for the populations that really need it and those communities. And so, again, thank you all. It was a wonderful conversation. And thank you to the attendees for joining us as always. And as Beth indicated, we're going to switch over to happy hour in a moment. So for those who haven't seen it before, the link is bit.ly/ BARI happy. People are welcome to join us there to continue the conversation more informally. And for those who cannot, we look forward to seeing you next week in a discussion of equity in education, appropriately placed on what should have been the last Friday of the public school year, at least in Boston. And so that will be another fun and I think riveting conversation as we think as a society about what to do next. So with that, everybody have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you then.
So do you move us to the